Thank you so much, Andrew, and thanks also to Andy Morse. It is an absolute honor and a pleasure to be here. Shout out to all of our friends in South Carolina who I know are watching on Zoom. So I am just going to set up our topic this evening. I'll start by talking a little bit about the South Carolina Historical Society to introduce it to those of you who don't know us, and then I'll introduce Captain Bernard Elliott and the Orderly Book, and then I'm going to turn it over to Melina to talk about the Battle of Sullivan's Island. So we are an important archival collection and research library and a museum with public programs, a publisher of 2 magazines. We are headquartered in Charleston, South Carolina, but we serve the entire state. We were founded in 1855, and we are a 501c3 nonprofit organization. We have our activities in Charleston are split between 2 different locations. This beautiful Robert Mills 1826 building called the Fireproof Building is our headquarters where our admin offices and our Museum of South Carolina History is located. Here's the other side of it. It's on Meeting Street between Chalmers and Broad, and we have a wonderful exhibition on South Carolina history. This is the elliptical staircase that's attached to the wall, a view of our exhibition. And then our archival collections are housed at the College of Charleston. They have been since 2015 at the Addlestone Library. We have collections going back to the founding of the South Carolina colony. This is just a small example of things we have relating to the Revolution, including the papers of Henry Laurens and Arthur Middleton that relate to South Carolina taking government into its own hands and to the Continental Congress. We have the Battle of Gabriel Manigo that describes the siege of Charleston. We have this Fourth Regiment order book. We have other regimental order books, and we have another letter book with another firsthand account of the Battle of Sullivan's Island from a different location from Fort Johnson. So very rich and important materials. We publish a quarterly scholarly magazine as well as a more general interest magazine called Carolog, which are benefits of being a supporter of the organization. And as I said earlier, we do serve the entire state. So we do programming and tours and things around this whole state of South Carolina. Okay, so Bernard Elliott. These are portraits of Bernard Elliott and his first wife from the Gibbs Museum of Art in Charleston by Jeremiah Theus, an artist who painted really the rice planter aristocracy in Charleston from the middle of the 18th century until the end. And so you see that this kind of establishes Bernard Elliott as someone who was part of the elite rice planting class in South Carolina. Here's a small miniature painting, also from the Gibbs. So he's born in 1740, educated in England. He has a plantation in Colleton County, also obviously house in Charleston. He is active in both the royal government and then after the provincial Congress is established by South Carolinians, he becomes a member of that. And he joins the Fourth Regiment at its founding as a captain, and he's always known as Captain Elliot, but he is quickly promoted and ends up a colonel before his untimely death in 1778. But the front of the order book says Captain Elliot, so that's kind of how he's known, even though he was only a captain very shortly. This is a picture of the cover of the orderly book. It covers September 1775 to March 1778. You're sort of regular the regimental orders, sort of accounts of things that they experience and things that happen, and then a lot of writing about discipline and punishment, which Melina will talk about. The Battle of Sullivan's Island is an especially sort of major part of what the orderly describes, and that's, I think, probably one of the most interesting aspects of the book. It also describes the first raising of the so-called Moultrie flag over Fort Johnson at the very beginning of the book. And for those of you who may not know, we have not only do we have firsthand written accounts, but we have firsthand painted accounts of the battle itself, where South Carolina regiment in a palmetto log fort on the sand fought off not just the British Army, but the mighty British Navy. And here's the day after. These were painted by Lieutenant Henry Gray of the 2nd Regiment, also at the Gibbs Museum in Charleston. And so that's the reason, for those who may not know, that the palmetto flag or the palmetto tree is the center of the flag of South Carolina to this day. So I am now going to pass it over to Melina to do more military history.
Thank you, Dr. Chew. Thank you to the Society of the Cincinnati and the American Revolution Institute for hosting this lecture and giving us the platform to share this amazing orderly book that we were able to bring to present to you all today. The Fourth Regiment order book, as Elizabeth mentioned, chronicles the daily orders of an artillery regiment that was based in Charleston and led by Bernard Elliott during the American Revolution. It was mostly recorded by the same unnamed orderly between 1775 and 1776. We know this because the handwriting is the same for the majority of the book. And it's a pretty dramatic shift right at the end where you find a new orderly who's showing up there with a new penmanship style and really a new narration style. The orderly was often the personal assistant of a specific officer, so it kind of tracks that he left when Captain Elliot left. Among other things, which I'll discuss a little bit later on in this lecture, the order book enumerates rules for the conduct of soldiers. So this is one rule that appears on July 25th, 1776. And this is kind of the framing for my whole lecture here. It says, quote, "No vice can be so destructive at all times to an army as gaming. It wins fortunes, corrupts morals, relaxes discipline, and creates deadly feuds and animosities amongst men who ought to be united as one band of brothers. But at this solemn crisis, when the lives, prosperities, and liberties, not only of the present generation, but of all American posterity, are at stake, it is more particularly indecent and odious. In short, in our present circumstances, it is ungentlemanlike, dishonest, wicked, and impious. With astonishment and horror, therefore, the General Charles Lee has learned that several officers, both Continental and militia, daily are guilty of this abominable vice. In consequence of this information, he thinks it his public duty to apprise the whole army that he will prosecute, to the utmost vigor of the law, those who trespass in this article, let their rank be what it will." Unquote. To further illustrate this, I've pulled this 1800 trompe-l'oeil painting by Charleston artist Charles Fraser, which comes from our neighbor at the Historical Society, the Gibbs Museum of Art. And it shows an 18th century playing card, so you can see it has no printed numbers in the corners there. But layered under the card, more interestingly, is a little newspaper that he's painted on there, and it's dated July 25th, which happens to be the same date as that little piece that I just read from the order book. So there's kind of a coincidence there. What are the odds of that? Anyway, risking the disdain and possible wrath of the general from beyond the grave, I'd like to relax discipline a bit this evening and present the story of the Battle of Sullivan's Island, as it was recorded in detail in the Fourth Regiment Order Book, as a game of cards. And in the summer of 1776, when the Fourth Regiment was both fighting this battle and getting busted for gaming, that game undoubtedly would have been whist. Now, if you don't have the gambling habits of an 18th century soldier and are unfamiliar with whist, it's a very simple trick-taking card game. It typically involves 4 players, split into teams of 2, and each round, each player plays 1 card from their hand. Each card must be of the same suit, unless a player possesses a trump card, which is a card of a certain suit that's decided before each round. The winner of the round is the player who has played the highest card of the suit of the round, or a trump card. So tonight, I'm going to wargame the Battle of Sullivan's Island for you as a game of whist. And first, I'll need to deal out the special cards that I illustrated for our 4 players, who I've divided into 2 teams, America and Britain. On the American team, we'll start with player 1 as the Fourth South Carolina Regiment. They're led by Major Bernard Elliot, whose strength is military leadership and weaknesses are his hairline, and his first cousin whom he married. This first wife, Mary, who was in the painting that Dr. Chew showed earlier, she died in 1774, and in 1776, when the battle is going to take place, Bernard Elliott is freshly promoted and remarried. We'll hear more about his second wife, Susanna, a little bit later this evening. They will also draw a cannon. This one that I have drawn is a 12-pounder, but the 4th Regiment operated all kinds of cannons and artillery ordnance. And a palmetto tree, which is ubiquitous in the Low Country. Player 2 on the American team is the 2nd South Carolina Regiment. They are being led by Colonel William Moultrie, who maintains his graying locks and what can best be described as an 18th century mullet. And he's the overall commander for both the 2nd and 4th Regiments at Sullivan's Island. Moultrie is also credited with making fashionable this cool flag. This eventually inspired the South Carolina state flag, as we saw earlier. Hopefully that's not too much of a spoiler for how the battle's going to go. And finally, 2nd Regiment will get Sergeant William Jasper. As I've been doing research on the Battle of Sullivan's Island in the Historical Society archives, I came across this neat poster that was drawn in 1926 for the 150th anniversary of the battle. The anniversary of this battle is celebrated every year in Charleston as Carolina Day, and there's plenty of local festivities. And for the 150th, the artist who took it upon themselves to draw this poster took some artistic liberty in designing Sergeant Jasper. He is looking quite handsome, muscular, and notably shirtless. So I have kept with this 99-year-old tradition, and the final card they will draw is Sexy William Jasper. On the British team, player 3 is the Royal Naval Fleet. They are led by Admiral Sir Peter Parker, who famously lost his breeches during the battle, but not his wig. He is sailing aboard the HMS Bristol, and they also drew sand. That's not necessarily what you want to see while you're being a naval. Okay. And finally, player 4 is the British Army. They are led by Major General Sir Henry Clinton. Catch some waves, and also a suspiciously American-looking rifle. All right, so we have met our players. We have the cards dealt. If anyone in the audience wants to get your bets in, do them discreetly so the general doesn't see. It is now the summer of 1776. The guys are all out on a map. Let's play Battle of Sullivan's Island Whist. Sir Peter Parker is going to make the first move, playing the HMS Bristol into Charleston Harbor. Upon seeing the British fleet in the harbor, which began gathering well in advance of the actual battle, General Charles Lee made an announcement to the people of Charleston. On June 20th, the order book reads, quote, "As it now appears almost a certainty from the intelligence of some deserters, the enemy's intention is to make an attack on the city. And as the general is confident that the number and spirit of the garrison will prevent their landing, it only remains to guard against the injury which the city may receive from their cannons. The Continental troops, provincials, and militia are therefore most earnestly conjured to work with not less alacrity than fight with courage. True soldiers and magnanimous citizens must brandish the pickaxe and spade as well as the sword in defense of their country. 1 or 2 days' labor at this critical juncture may not only save many worthy families from ruin, but many worthy individuals from loss of limbs and life." Unquote. So Charleston is on high alert at this time. Not only the military, but also all of the civilians have been called into the defense as well. Let's see what Major Elliott will play. Major Elliott deploys his palmetto tree card out to Sullivan's Island, where a fort is being built in an advantageous spot at the very entrance of the harbor. It's fairly primitive, and the Americans are just kind of scrounging up whatever building materials they can make use of. General Lee was not impressed with the walls that were constructed out of palmetto tree logs and sand, and he described it in a letter as, quote, "a very imperfect and ill-planned fort out on Sullivan's Island." It was Colonel Moultrie who finally convinced Lee not to abandon it just before the battle. Speaking of Colonel Moultrie, he is going to plant his Moultrie flag right there at Fort Sullivan, rallying both the 2nd and 4th Regiment artillery in defense of the island, and therefore of Charleston. Meanwhile, Sir Henry Clinton is attempting a land invasion to support the naval attack and is bringing his troops Charlestonward across Long Island, what is today known as Isle of Palms. Separating this island from Sullivan's Island is a short passage of rough waters known as Breach Inlet. And it is here that Clinton's troops will encounter the dreaded Waves card, which will slow their invasion drastically. That's round one. The map is laid for battle. Let's play a few more cards before we judge who the winners are. For his second card, Sir Peter Parker will unfortunately have to lay his sand card. This is going to run aground part of his fleet and force other ships to hang back in the harbor. Once in position, the British fleet will begin to fire upon Fort Sullivan. The order book reports the battle as such. It says, quote, 10 minutes before 11 o'clock this morning, a bomb ship threw a bomb of 13 inches diameter into Fort Sullivan, which fell upon the magazine there, but did no considerable damage. At the same time, the Bristol, a ship of 50 guns, the Experiment of 50 guns, the Siren of 28, the Action of 28, the Active of 28, the Solebay of 28, the Sphinx of 20 guns, the Friendship of 26 guns, all weighed anchor and drawing up their courses bore down to Fort Sullivan, unquote. You may have caught in that excerpt that the palmetto trees are doing their job. Fort Sullivan, for all of its imperfections, is standing up really well to the British cannonade. It turns out these spongy trunks of the palmettos are actually really effective at deflecting and absorbing cannonballs, and are proving a worthy defense despite all of General Lee's doubts. Still, Captain Elliot is going to order his artillerymen to fire back. Ordnance had been arriving at Fort Sullivan for months. As early as April 2nd, the order book records that 20 mattresses or artillery crewmen loaded up a flatboat with 26-pound cannons that were to be transferred from Fort Johnson over there on James Island across the harbor to Sullivan's Island. And those guns were ready to go on the morning of June 28th. The order book continues the account. Quote, the fort fired as soon as the two 50-gun ships, the Bristol and Experiment, came within distance along with the Siren, which there made the first line. They immediately dropped anchor with springs on their cables and began a smart cannonade, which was returned with coolness and deliberation from the fort. The second line of frigates supported the first, and an incessant fire was kept up until 11 o'clock at night, when the ships, as well as the fort, ceased firing. Unquote. In the chaos and destruction of the battle, Colonel Moultrie's flag goes down. He will play the Sergeant Jasper card for the occasion. A few days after the battle, the Fourth Regiment recorded the actions of Sergeant Jasper in the order book, complete with drama and dialogue. The orderly writes, quote, on the day of the engagement between the King of England's fleet and Fort Sullivan, where he, Sergeant Jasper, is with the company and regiment that he belongs to, which was the 2nd South Carolina Regiment at this point, he singularized himself in the following manner. The flagstaff being shot and the flag falling to the ground in the heat of the action, Jasper called to his Colonel Moultrie, Colonel, don't let us fight without our colors. How can you help it, replied the colonel. The staff is gone. Then I'll replace it, said Jasper, upon which he leaped over Sergeant McDaniel of Captain Eugee's company, a good and brave man, having his stomach and bowels shot away by a cannonball, called out in these words, fight on, my boys, don't let liberty expire with me today, which animated the soldiers that they fought, if possible, with double fury, and Sergeant McDaniel died immediately. Will, that's Sergeant Jasper, took the flag and tied it to a sponge staff, what they would have been using to clean out the cannons, and stuck it up on the merlin of the bastion next to the enemy, gave 3 huzzahs, huzzah, 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 in the dangerous place that he stood, and retired to his gun where he fought with his gallant company to the end of the battle, unquote. Sergeant Jasper is often remembered as the hero of Sullivan's Island. The replacing of the flag was not merely just this morale or respect thing, it was really the revolutionary way of communication. Especially in the midst of the battle, when all of this was limited, the flag was serving as a sign that the battle was ongoing and was not lost. So Sergeant Jasper's replacing of the flag was an important action that kept the 2nd and 4th Regiments fighting all the way through 11 p.m. when the firing finally ceased. The order book describes this moment as well. It says the British ceased firing, quote, because they had been much shattered and had the following numbers killed and wounded. The Bristol, on board of which was Sir Peter Parker, Commodore, lost her captain's arm, 44 killed and 30 wounded, all of her masts torn to splinters, and she prodigiously hulled. The experiment had 57 killed and 30 wounded, and her captain killed. Active had her first lieutenant killed, and one master's eye and cheek shot away. Solibay Captain Hunt, 2 killed and 4 wounded. Actaeon run on shore. Sphinx lost her bowsprit, and otherwise was much damaged. The thunder bomb beds were shattered, and she's unfit to continue the bombardment, unquote. And the Americans ceased firing, quote, because they had no more powder. The loss at the fort was but 10 men killed and 22 wounded. So wonderfully did God appear on our behalf that the men of war cut their cables in the dead of night and stole away to their old stations to refit. This morning, the Actaeon was fired upon from our fort. The enemy left her and put fire to her, and by night she was burnt down. The battle has decidedly settled in the Americans' favor. Let's check on how Sir Henry Clinton is doing over there, fighting the waves on Long Island. Having the cards really stacked against him, he is forced to play the rifle card. And those are, in fact, American rifles. Specifically, the rifles of American Colonel Danger Thompson's snipers, who begin to pick off Clinton's invaders as they cross Breach Inlet. As recorded in the order book, General Lee will later commend Colonel Thompson and the corps under him for their spirited and gallant behavior in preventing the enemy from making good their landing on the east end of Sullivan's Island. So let's add up our points whist style at this point. In the first round, it seemed as though the HMS Bristol was the high card, and those palmetto trees were a surprise trump card, defeating the Bristol and the entire British fleet all against the odds. Major Elliott, the 4th Regiment, and the American team wins round 1. In round 2, the British both drew pretty unlucky cards, and even though those cannons were important at Fort Sullivan, I'll have to hand this round to the hero of Sullivan's Island, Sergeant William Jasper. That makes a point for Colonel Moultrie and the 2nd Regiment, and an overwhelming 2-0 victory for Team USA. Huzzah, that is how you play whist as a card game. As a war game, sorry. A few days later, on July 1st, it is recorded in the 4th Regiment order book that, quote, on this day, General Lee visited the garrison at Fort Sullivan. And when the regiment there was drawn out with a small detachment of the Corps of Artillery, that's the 4th Regiment, he, General Lee, at their head, returned them his thanks for their gallant defense of the fort against a fleet of 8 men of war in the bomb, that's the British ships, during a cannonade of 11 hours and a bombardment of 7 hours, unquote. In addition to this visit from General Lee, Major Elliott's second wife is going to visit the regiments. I mentioned her earlier. Her name is Susanna Elliott Smith, and she had been raised by her aunt Rebecca Mott, who would later become really famous for permitting the British-occupied home that she was living in to be burned down in the name of the revolution. But first, still on July 1st, 1776, Mrs. Barnard Elliot, the lady of Major Elliott, quote, complimented the 2nd Regiment at the same time with a very elegant pair of colors. Delivering the following words to the regiment, who with rested arms received them, she said, your gallant behavior in defense of liberty and your country entitles you to the highest honor. Accept these 2 standards as a reward justly due your regiment, and I make not the least doubt, under heaven's protection, but you will stand by them as long as they can wave in the air of liberty, unquote. The Battle of Sullivan's Island is over and won. Charleston has been defended for now, and it's the desire of many men to unwind a bit. But there's still a lot of war left to fight, and according to the order book, Elliot had to issue this reminder to his men after the battle. It says, quote, as it is one of the essential parts of service that regularly should be carefully attended to from the first officer to the last recruit, the soldier being obliged to hold himself in continual readiness to parade, is by that means kept constantly employed in preserving his arms, clothes, accoutrements, and person in proper order. An employment in becoming a good soldier is infinitely preferable to an idle, lazy habit of loitering on beds in the day, meditating mischief for the night, or killing time by gaming, which last practice is generally the production of ruin of the pursuer, unquote. Clearly, whist is still in the hot seat, even for veteran troops. And unless the soldiers can quickly explain their card game in a way that describes the battle just as we did, or maybe are religiously inclined like the soldier in that good old song, The Deck of Cards, gaming is a punishable offense, and courts-martial for a variety of infractions plague the 4th Regiment, particularly in the months following the Battle of Sullivan's Island. Consequences range from physical punishment for offenses like gaming, sleeping on duty, or gold bricking in the hospitals, up to execution for desertion, which was common since the regiment was stationed in Charleston and was made up of many local men who still had friends and family in the area. However, on August 19th, a few flaunters of the law cut a lucky break from one of their officers, a Colonel Roberts. The order book cites his orders as follows. It says, quote, "The regiment to be under arms immediately to attend a punishment. The colonel, being always more inclined to correct than to punish, thinks proper to remit 200 lashes of Delaney's sentence and 350 of Woods's." These are two men who were sentenced for unrecorded crimes, in full hopes that of their yet becoming, in the future, reformed men and more dutiful soldiers, which, should they prove, they may yet show themselves worthy asserters of that glorious cause which they have most solemnly engaged with their lives to defend, unquote. So perhaps even if we are found guilty here of gaming in the ranks, we will find some mercy among our officers. Beyond October 5th, 1776, the record of the order book becomes less regular. After Sullivan's Island, Bernard Elliott had been promoted to lieutenant colonel, but he took leave from the regiment in the fall to attend some family members who had fallen ill. A new handwriting picks up sporadically near the back of the book, which signifies a new orderly who, unfortunately for us future historians, was far less diligent in recording every daily detail of life in the 4th Regiment. However, this orderly did capture one of the cheekiest regimental challenge and password combinations. These were written in the order book nearly every day and would have been used to help prevent against enemy infiltration. This particular combination truly describes the significance of the 4th Regiment's place in American Revolution history, which is parole or challenge, not to be countersign wondered at. If there is anything you still are wondering at, the order book is on display here tonight in its conserved form, and is also available fully scanned and transcribed on the Low Country Digital Library for future reference. LCDL is a joint effort by over 24 museums and archives in the Charleston area to make our collections more accessible. So you'll find the order book, other Revolution-era documents, and history spanning all of South Carolina's 350-year history from the Historical Society. You'll find artwork like that Charles Fraser painting of the playing card I showed earlier from the Gibbs Museum of Art, and all kinds of other historical gems from other historical institutions. Links to LCDL and our online catalog are available at schistory.org. Please visit us at the Fireproof Building in Addlestone Library if you ever find yourself in the historic city of Charleston. Again, my name is Melina Testin of the South Carolina Historical Society. It was a pleasure to share this lecture and game of whist with you all. Thank you.
Thank you, Melina. Thank you, Elizabeth. We will be having a Q&A session. So if you're here in person and have a question, please raise your hand. I have a handheld mic. I'll bring it over to you. That way everybody online can hear.
Hey, thank you. That was fun. How do you happen to have this book? What's the history of the book itself?
Yeah, great question. Question we're still wondering about. There is no exact record of when the order book came into our collection or who exactly donated it. The best I can do is this handwritten note that we found from the Dark Ages back before there were donor records and very detailed spreadsheets. And it says the donor, perhaps a descendant of Mrs. Mary Lucia Lowndes, who was a granddaughter of Bernard Elliott, whose name appears on the flyleaf. So possibly maybe somebody who came from the Barnard Elliot line.
Hi, really enjoyed your presentation. I happened to be in Charleston a few weeks ago, and I visited the small little park at Breach Inlet on the Sullivan's Island side. I was wondering, were the British, both Parker and Clinton, so inflexible in their orders they couldn't change things, and they kept pushing them in toward that inlet? Could they have landed somewhere else on Sullivan's Island?
Thank you. From what I understand, they didn't realize the extent of the waves that were going on in that area. They thought that the tide would ebb and they would be able to cross throughout shallow water and across the sand there, and they just kind of got unlucky with the timing, and the waves are more intense than they believed. So that's my understanding of what occurred there.
Thank you very much for the game of whist. I enjoyed it. Sullivan's Island. Do you know how it got its name originally? Which Sullivan?
don't remember his first name, but Sullivan's Island was a major landing point for slave ships, and there was a sort of a quarantine there, and that was the name of the person who sort of managed that system. That's who the island became named for. I'm afraid that I don't know. I don't know. Do you know that?
I'm
name?
not sure what his first name was.
I'm sure somebody in South Carolina on Zoom knows.
Can you go over what other information did you find in the book that maybe is outside of the fighting but just a general picture of the time that that this was um, written in.
Yeah, so the it starts out with actually an interesting account of a raid on Fort Johnson. So the very first action that's described in the order book is about the Fourth Regiment back when they were just part of the militia, going into Fort Johnson and finding that the British had abandoned it. So that's kind of the very first section of the book, and then it goes through defenses that are building up in Charleston, kind of the daily life of building up defenses, preparing for some kind of invasion, and what the men are doing, what they're eating, where they're living, all of that kind of stuff. We do have at the Historical Society a podcast that one of my colleagues, Sydney, has been putting together, which goes just kind of week by week what's going on in the order book. So I would definitely encourage you to go to our website and check that out.
And could you tell us about how many the population, how many on both sides? You talked about the ships, but how many defenders were they?
I'm afraid I don't have an accurate number right off the top of
maybe.
my head.
We do have some questions online if you don't mind taking a few more, Melina or Elizabeth. Um, one question relates to the differences. Obviously, there are two pretty big events in Charleston during the American Revolution. You have obviously Sullivan's Island, which we discussed tonight, and then in 1780, the British come back with full vengeance. Can you describe, big success on the first go for the Americans, not so much on the second? Can you compare the two, Sullivan's Island and the siege of Charleston? What did the British do differently that made them so successful?
I'm not as versed on the actual invasion part going on in 1780. Just starting out here with the Battle of Sullivan's Island. But I understand that they started to arrest and put on house arrest lost of the Patriots who were in Charleston. And so I think maybe they had a better effort at rounding up folks and kind of disbanding the resistance that was going on in the city.
Also, they came on foot, and not they entered the city on foot, even though there were defenses. So some of our colleagues have gone over to London to the National Archives and done new research on the occupation, and there is an excellent report on that new research about the occupation, the sort of life in Charleston under the occupation, and it's on the website of the Powder magazine in downtown Charleston, which is run by the Colonial Dames. So if you just Google Charleston Powder magazine occupation, you can find this document. It's that anyone can download and read. It's really interesting new research.
Great, thank you. Question for either of you. How do you know how much land Bernard Elliott owned and how many houses in South Carolina?
He had a plantation in Colleton County. He had other land outside of Charleston, but I don't know the number of acres.
Okay. And you said that he had an unfortunate sudden cause of death in 1778. What was that cause of death?
So I did some digging trying to figure out what happened to him, and I'm at a loss for records on what the exact details were. We know that he was transferred to Command Fort Johnson in 1777. And so he died at about 35 years old in 1778 in October of that year. And so my best guess was that it was something related to the Revolution still while he was commanding Fort Johnson. But I have not been able to locate a record that gives details about his death.
He's buried in St. Philip's Churchyard in downtown Charleston.
Okay, thank you. One person would like to know if Governor Campbell was present during the battle and on one of the ships, the Royal Governor.
I'm not sure.
Okay. One person says, I asked, was the handwriting as hard to read as it appears? I know of the Girard Trade Journal, which is from 1752 to 54. That was very hard to read as well. Are there services available for these journals to be transcribed? How?
So the orderly here actually has very beautiful, legible handwriting. Really, once you start reading into it, it becomes very easy to read, especially compared to lots of the other documents that we have in our archives that are significantly less legible. So I would say this is fairly easy to read. If you are not inclined to read all of the cursive handwriting, it is fully transcribed on the Low Country Digital Library.
The page on the screen is kind of bleeding through from one side to the other, and that makes it a little bit harder, but I think it's very easy to read compared to many other manuscripts that I've tried.
Great, thank you.
I just had to laugh. I'm a former teacher, and the big argument about cursive handwriting today, and people say, well, we need to teach cursive so you can read old documents. And I'm always saying, who's reading old documents?
We are.
Historians.
And now I know some people. That's very nice.
When we advertise for archival positions, we have to put requirement is that someone knows how to read cursive.
Oh my God. Oh, that's great. That's really interesting.
Just wonder, do you know, are there any Elliot descendants today?
He had at least one surviving son, and I think he might have had a second child as well. And normally in Charleston, I'm sure there are, and I'm sure I'm going to upset someone because in Charleston, but I don't personally know. Do you know Melina? He had a son, I think also named Bernard Elliott.
One person.
So today Fort Sullivan is called Fort Moultrie, and Sumter and Moultrie together are a National Park Service site in Charleston, and they're quite close together actually, and it is. I mean, obviously Sumter wasn't there then, but it's very difficult to imagine how close the ships were that they didn't destroy the fort. It's very hard to understand.
One person would like to know, do you have any other orderly books?
We do, yes. We have lots of other orderly books. Some of them are also digitized on the website here. We have an orderly book from the 2nd Regiment as well that was at Fort Sullivan during this battle. It's less flowery language than the 4th Regiment here, so it's more of a muster roll, but that one's also has to do with this battle.
Thank you for that presentation. Very innovative and engaging. What do you know about the Black presence during the Battle of Sullivan Island, both on the American side and on the British side, and the roles that they played? Were they soldiers, sailors, laborers, slaves? What was...
Well, the fort was built by enslaved laborers, and I know that members of the Catawba Nation did fight. So
Catawba being
indigenous,
American Indian?
yes, indigenous people. So who sided with the Americans. But I'm afraid that I don't know about black soldiers on either side.
Can I give you just one example?
Please,
Who
yeah,
there?
please.
Harry Washington was a slave of George Washington, who escaped in 1776 following Dunmore's proclamation, and then went down to Charleston as part of the Royal Artillery, and actually served there in battle. And then he went on to be evacuated from New York City to Nova Scotia. But that's
And there were, I mean, obviously, when the British left Charleston after the occupation, probably, you know, two or 3,000 formerly enslaved people went with them. A lot of whom ended up in Nova Scotia, and then and then later in
Sierra Leone.
Sierra Leone. Yeah, that's right.
Thank you. One more.
So what would Jasper's background have been like with his family? Since he could write, I'm assuming most people couldn't at that time or didn't have an education.
So the order book is written by the orderly of Captain Elliot. Sergeant Jasper is the one who saved the flag at Fort Sullivan. So he was just an enlisted soldier.
We don't know who the orderlies, what his name was.
We don't have any record of who exactly the identity of the person who wrote the orderly book is. He didn't sign his name on anything, but he would have been kind of the personal secretary of Captain Elliot.
He was obviously well educated, had a very nice hand, and had a literary turn, you know, a literary bent, I would say.
Well, you know, based on our discussion earlier, would you mind telling the audience what you told me earlier about, you know, the full bombardment throughout the day and the effect it had on the Americans or didn't have on the Americans?
Yeah, so the way that they describe it in the order book is really just kind of handing it to the British. They're describing all of these people who are dying on each of the British ships, and then they say only 10 people died at Fort Sullivan. So that's kind of an interesting choice that the authors made here to just really push in how effective the fort was. And they sustained about 7 hours of cannonade going on at the fort, and just speaks to the effectiveness of those palmetto trees.
They were getting hammered.
Should all go build our homes out of palmetto. Very good. Thank you very much, Melina and Elizabeth. Last chance. Any plugs for the South Carolina Historical Society while you're here?
Come visit us.
There you go. Very good. Well, thank you all very much. I think that's a great place to wrap up. Thank you all for attending in person and wherever you may be on Zoom. And as always, your continued support of our mission is much appreciated. So everybody get home safe, and we'll see you next time. Good night.